Okay. Last week we finished up our course on the biblical covenants, and we intentionally did that one first to lay the groundwork for this class. What we're going to do over the next, I don't know how long it'll take us, at least a year. We're not on any rush, but we're going to do a survey of the Old Testament. We are going to go at a pretty good clip in the sense that we'll be covering a Bible book a week. So it is a very broad view. It's the bird's eye view as opposed to the worm's eye view. But I think it will be extremely helpful just to get a grasp of the plan of God as it runs all the way through the Bible. We've talked about the books that we want to use for this class. And it really kind of depends on how much time you have and how deep you want to go. This is a very basic and a very good book by Paul Benware, Survey of the Old Testament. He covers every Old Testament book. Some get more pages than others, and he has some additional articles and graphics and pictures in here, but it's really well done. I know that some people have tried to get this book. It's very important that you get this edition as opposed to the one that's older. They redid this and kind of made it into one that's they use in the Bible colleges. I think this is hard to come by, it seems. Some of the sellers are out of it. And I've even heard, I think Vanita had an instance where she thought she was ordering this book and they sent the other one instead. Did you have that too?
The new one.
Okay. Okay. So I think he has another one, Survey of the New Testament, just like this, and I think those are more easy to get. But if you can, get one of these. At least one per family would be great, but it's a good book to have in your library. Now this is called Old Testament Theology by Paul House. He also treats every single book in the Old Testament. There are no pictures in this one. It's all text, and it's deeper theologically, to be sure. I still find it very readable. You may read it and think, well, I don't know what he's talking about, but I think it's very well done. It's a very clear book, and he really is especially good on showing how later revelation builds on earlier revelation. And that's going to be important for us in this class. In this study. I'm used to doing this in the Bible Institute. I can't remember if I did this before the covenants class or not. It seems to me that I did, but I want to talk a little bit about how we often read the Bible. We see this hard division between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and to some degree that's understandable. I mean, after all, there was a 400-year gap in between the time that these two testaments were written. One's in Hebrew, one's in Greek. One deals almost exclusively with the nation of Israel. The other is more about the church. And for us, the epistles in the New Testament are the things that are most relevant to us. Now, I say most relevant. All of the Bible is equally relevant to us. But the epistles do have the instruction to the church in them. The Gospels tell us about Christ and His ministry. So to me, in one sense, it's natural for us as believers in this age to gravitate towards the New Testament. I certainly was guilty of that, particularly before I went to seminary. But one thing that seminary did, and especially in a class like this, it changed my mind about that. And it taught me the importance of the whole Bible. It taught me even the importance of understanding the New Testament to the best that you can requires that you know what the Old Testament says. So I think what we often do is prioritize the New Testament. We read it more than we do the Old Testament. Certainly we know the stories of the Old Testament, the major stories, but we don't have a systematic understanding of the storyline that runs from Genesis to Malachi. And then what can be worse is that we read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament instead of the other way around. I would argue that I have to read the New Testament in light of the Old. But the Reformed tradition especially is guilty of this. They do it without apology. They say that New Testament revelation trumps Old Testament revelation. New Testament revelation tells us about Christ and is therefore superior. And the New Testament itself, they would argue, reinterprets the Old Testament. So they do this methodologically without apology. And they end up at a very different place eschatologically because of it. What I think the better way to read the Bible is to see the whole Bible as the Word of God and to read it from Genesis to Revelation. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only way you should ever read the Bible. I'm not saying that at all. But to understand the plan of God as it runs through the whole Bible, you have to do this. You can't read the New Testament first and then try to understand the Old Testament in light of that. You would never do that with any other book, right? You would never start 2/3 of the way through a book, read it to the end, and then go back and read the first 2/3. Wouldn't make sense to do that. Well, God has given us His Word in a progressive fashion over time, and we need to read it in the same way, same order in which it was given. I think I also ask you this when we started our covenants class, so this is kind of by way of review. Why do we as Christians need to study the Old Testament? After all, isn't it about Israel and we're not Israel? Doesn't it talk a lot about the law and we're not under the law? It has these books that have all these genealogies. What in the world does that have to do with us? So how would you answer that question? Why should we study the Old Testament?
Like you were saying, one reason is because it gives context to the New Testament.
Exactly.
It's hard to understand what's going on and what they're talking about in the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament.
Exactly. I mean, God gave the Old Testament first. It provides context for the events of the New Testament. Certainly you can read the epistles and gain a lot without knowing the Old Testament. But even in the epistles, there are citations back to the Old Testament. Book of Revelation, 400 verses total, over half of them make some allusion back to the Old Testament. What other reasons are there?
It's kind of the same thing. I mean, Benware points out that the New Testament writers assume you have this knowledge and understanding.
Exactly. And I think it's a fair assumption, right? I mean, they're writing to the people of their day, and they do assume that that have some familiarity with the Old Testament. Even the Gentiles who were proselytes and attached themselves to the house of Israel got Old Testament instruction in the synagogue. So they do
I
assume.
think also that we can see Christ in the Old Testament all the way through.
Okay. Christ.
Once we understand, that the prophecies and the knowledges and everything, then we can go back and almost every book of the Old Testament talks about Christ.
Okay. So there are predictions and prophecies concerning Christ. And again, think about how much of the Old Testament talks about this future millennial kingdom that will be led about Christ. Well, that's relevant for us because we're going to be part of that kingdom. So, it changes your perspective when you come to understand that. And
Plus, I think the validation or the fact that if you look at it, that you have this volume that was written so many years before this next volume was written, and how that next volume of the Gospels reveal the Old Testament prophecies, then the rest of the and then Revelation goes back. So you see the big gap. There's no such literature in the world that can accomplish that without the Holy Spirit.
That's right.
Written the whole thing and preserve the whole thing precisely to the language, to the just the details are so incredible.
that's right.
That we can see.
That's a very good point and argument, is just the unity of the whole Bible and
Exactly.
how the New Testament accomplishes what's anticipated in the Old Testament.
To the point of, and
Down to the jot and tittle, exactly. Okay, so you've come up with some good ones already. 2/3 of our Bible is in the Old Testament. If we neglect that, we're neglecting a large part of the revelation of God. New Testament can only be properly understood against the background of the Old Testament. The Bible of the New Testament writers was the Old Testament. This was the Bible of Christ's day. These writers often quote from the Old Testament. They assume that you're familiar with its characters and content. We've said that already. The same God is the creator of both Testaments. This is really related to what Frank said. You can't know well the character of God unless you study the Old Testament. Many Old Testament prophecies are fulfilled in the New Testament, and many still remain to be fulfilled. Now, the New Testament picks up on some of those prophecies and puts them out to a future day, but the only way that you can know which ones are fulfilled and which ones are not are to know what the Old Testament says in its own context. when you read the Gospels, you're reading about events that took place under an Old Testament economy. Now, this is something I think is especially important. We can make this hard and fast division between the Old Testament and the New Testament and not be cognizant that the real change came at Pentecost. When you're reading the Gospels, you should have an Old Testament mindset. I mean, you're still operating under a Mosaic economy. And even Jesus' ministry in the Gospels is to the nation of Israel. So it's true that the Gospels are written to the church because eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry are starting to pass off the scene, and there's a need for a record of what he said and did and taught that we're given in the Gospels. But I think it's equally important to recognize that it's at Pentecost that the church is born, and that's going to impact the way that you interpret the Gospels. Many of the Old Testament's teachings are timeless principles. What do I mean by that? What is time? What are some books of the Old Testament? Proverbs. What else? Psalms. Ecclesiastes. What are all these books that we're naming Heaven Common? They're all wisdom literature. I love the wisdom literature. And Proverbs, now I talked about the fact that I had neglected the Old Testament for a long time, I feel like, in my life. I always loved Proverbs. There's certain books that I loved. Psalms, I didn't have any trouble reading. We often will have New Testaments that include Psalms and Proverbs. I have grown in my love, especially for Ecclesiastes and Job, even. I think Job is an incredible book. I'm in the middle of reading it right now in my quiet time. So these are things that it doesn't matter that they're timeless in the sense that they're always relevant, always applicable to people of all times. The wisdom literature kind of stands apart in the Old Testament canon in that it doesn't advance the story of Israel. And I'll have a slide that shows a little bit more about that. Not everything is restated and reapplied in the New Testament. Certain things are, to be sure, but can you think of something that is taught very explicitly in the Old Testament that's not really addressed again in the New Testament?
Creation.
Creation is the prime example. Maybe there's references or allusions to God's creation, the fact that He is the creator in the New Testament, but it's not spelled out in the New Testament the way it is in the Old Testament. That's the one that I'm thinking of, is creation in particular, but there's certainly others. Finally, this is the last one. Two basic yet essential themes of the Bible begin in the Old Testament. Now, there's more than two, to be sure, but there's two that I'm looking for here that we want to talk about a little bit more this morning. One of them is one that we just finished our study on, and that's covenant. What would you take a shot at as the second one, a theme that begins in the Old Testament and that runs all the way through the Bible and is especially important at the end of the Bible?
Salvation.
Salvation is one, or redemption is another way to say it. Redemption is another very important one because God redeems not only the souls of men but all creation. But the one I'm looking for here is kingdom. Kingdom is one that begins very early in the Old Testament revelation. And, of course, Christ is the one who comes and rules first over this earth for 1,000 years, and then God and Christ rule into the eternal state forever and ever. So we've talked about the covenants already. This is a diagram that you've seen before. The Abrahamic being the most fundamental and basic, promising land, seed, and blessing. The Mosaic, where God entered into covenant with the whole nation of Israel. He defined the relationship between himself and Israel. And the Mosaic was the means by which the promises of the Abrahamic covenant would be worked out. The Davidic covenant defined the kingdom, promised David and his line that they would never lack a man to sit upon the throne of Israel. And of course, that Davidic king was responsible for leading the nation of Israel in keeping the law. And as they did that, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So even though it's a covenant that's made with Israel, it has impact on all peoples, all the nations. And then the new covenant, we said, is not absolutely new, but it is largely an enablement so that Israel actually keeps the law of God the way that God designed for them to. And again, there's a point at which in the future that happens and all the covenants find their full fulfillment. And that is during the millennial kingdom when Christ is ruling on the earth, Israel is regenerated and living as the people of God. The nations are blessed through that. All that is still future to us today. All right, let's look at the mediatorial kingdom of God as it runs through history. Early on, there was not a monarchy in Israel. God had a theocracy where he was the king. His law and his teaching was mediated through the priest, and he was the supreme king of Israel. They were not to have a king initially, like all the other nations did. They ended up wanting one, and God granted them that request. And for about 112 years, there was a united monarchy. Israel and Judah were not divided. And the first king of Israel was whom? Saul, then David, and then Solomon. Solomon, of course, followed in the line of David. But because of Solomon's sin in 931, the kingdom divided. 10 tribes went to the north and only 2 to the south, Judah and Benjamin. It is that southern kingdom that continues the line of David. The northern kingdom was taken into captivity in 722 BC by Assyria because of their idolatry. And as that took place, and as the southern kingdom looks to be headed in the same direction, is also going to be taken into captivity, God sends prophets. He sends prophets that we call the latter prophets to call the southern kingdom back to himself, to call them to covenant loyalty, to keep the law of God. But they fail in that. They too are taken captive by Babylonia in 586 BC. And at that point, the southern kingdom, the throne of David, ceased to exist. I mean, there is no king. There's not really a nation in the sense that they're under somebody else's authority. But the line of David is preserved. It's preserved all the way down to the New Testament times. And then who burst on the scene? John the Baptist. John the Baptist is really, his ministry is more like that of an Old Testament prophet. And he comes in preparation for the coming of Christ. What is his message? Repent. For the kingdom is at hand. Now what is the context there? And what kingdom is he talking about? Okay, it's the Davidic kingdom. So the context and background are the kingdom back in the Old Testament. There's an awful lot of the Old Testament books that deal with the kings and their various rules. What else can we say about the kingdom that he's proclaiming? It has its historical background in the kingdom that existed in the Old Testament. Does the Old Testament say anything else about it? I guess my point is that these prophets are prophesying a future kingdom, a future king and Messiah that will be much different than the kings that they've had in the past. He will actually be successful in leading the nation of Israel and keeping the law. So, again, if you're just reading the New Testament, you read John the Baptist, and you could hear this phrase, the kingdom of heaven, and think, well, he's talking about salvation. He's talking about living with God in heaven. Isn't that what the kingdom of heaven is about? Well, it's the kingdom that has its background and its prophecy in the Old Testament. It's very important to understand that. Not only was that the message of John the Baptist, but also of Christ and his apostles. Early on in Jesus' ministry, he's preaching the same message. What was the response to that message in Jesus' day? Isaiah?
People got baptized.
Okay, there were a number of people that got baptized by John the Baptist in preparation for the kingdom. Did the kingdom come? I mean, we said that it was proclaimed that it was at hand. Did Christ come and rule from the throne of David? No. Why? Unbelief. His own people rejected him. The leaders of the nation of Israel, I think we would say, were particularly culpable in rejecting Christ and opposing him. And in fact, during his ministry, as they did that, he changed. He stopped talking about the nearness of the kingdom, and he started teaching that the kingdom of heaven is like something. He started teaching in parables. And his purpose in doing that was to hide truth from those that were opposing him and to reveal new truths to those that were committed to following him. So there's a phase of the kingdom here that was completely unanticipated in the Old Testament. You know, we can't just read the Old Testament and not read the New Testament. The Old Testament, as you read it, you anticipate that there's going to be a single coming of the Christ and that he's going to set up his kingdom, and that didn't happen. Instead, there's a phase of the kingdom that began basically in Matthew, at the end of Matthew 12 and the beginning of Matthew 13, where Christ turns to this parabolic ministry, and will only end when Christ comes back the second time. And during this time, which includes the age in which we live in now, the kingdom of heaven is like these various parables that Jesus teaches about.
But then we see Isaiah 53, where it was very clear, prophesied that this coming Messiah will have to die and
Right.
crucified and everything before the kingdom is set up. So
Yes.
they're really their expectation were, if they didn't read that portion, they expected to have him set up the kingdom right away. But if they brought that in, that prophecy in, then that's why they had trouble in understanding Christ, because they said, Lord, you know, where are you going to go? Where are you going to die?
Right.
You shouldn't be dying. You know?
Right. And I would argue it's very clear for us, especially on this side of the cross, to see that that's what Isaiah 53 is talking about. I don't disagree that that's a clear chapter about Christ's crucifixion. And there are a few other places. For example, Daniel 9 talks about the fact that he's going to be cut off. But by comparison, to me, it seems there's very few references to his crucifixion in comparison to his coming and ruling and being victorious. For us, it's clear, where we stand in history, that he had to come the first time and die for sin, that he's coming again. He even began to teach his own disciples that he was going to have to come back rather than it all be done.
So we're not saying that had the Jews accepted him as a Messiah, then there would be no crucifixion or nothing. He would have set up his kingdom and kept going.
Okay, so that's a good question. Obviously, in the plan of God, he knew that Christ was going to be accepted, and in fact, it was part of his plan that Christ was going to die for sin. So the question then becomes, was it a legitimate offer? When Christ and John the Baptist come on the scene and say, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, are they really saying, well, we know this is not going to happen? I don't think so. I think it was a legitimate offer. I think men were responsible for what they did to Christ in rejecting him, and at the same time, I would argue it was all part of the plan of God that it happened that way.
The Lamb was slain from his foundation.
That's right. But in the same way that I would argue that the fall, man is responsible for the fact that he rebelled and sinned against God, and yet God, it was part of his plan from the very beginning.
But then it would have been impossible without Christ's sacrifice to set up a perfect world with his coming.
That's right.
Because there would be no way to put up his sin.
Exactly. That's right. He had to die for sin. Okay, so I said that this is the period that we're living in now, but it's not this phase of the kingdom is not strictly equivalent to the church. The church actually starts after that point of rejection that's described in Matthew 12. It starts at Pentecost with the descent of the Holy Spirit, and the church is taken out before the 7 years of tribulation in the day of the Lord. So the church is kind of a subset of the mysteries of the kingdom, and there's certainly application of those parables to the present age in the church, but they're not strictly equivalent. All right? When does this phase that's in red, this unanticipated phase of the kingdom that's described by the parables of Christ, when does it end?
When the Jewish people come back to him as a nation,
So, when will that be?
sometime in the tribulation.
Okay, during the tribulation period, I would say it completely ends with the return of Christ. Some of the parables deal with the fact that he's going to separate, like the dragnet. It separates out the good fish and the bad fish. The wheat and the tares, allow them to grow until the time of the harvest. And then God himself will separate the wicked from the righteous. So his return, and it's true that Israel, as part of this, Israel has to come and accept their Messiah, and that does happen during the tribulation period. I think his return is what ends that phase of the kingdom. Of course, then he rules and reigns on the earth for 1,000 years. And that is in complete continuity with what the prophets anticipated in the Old Testament. At the end of that 1,000 years, even though it began with all believers, Satan is released. He'd been bound for that 1,000 years. And he brings one final rebellion against Christ in the holy city. And that's put down with fire from heaven. And then you have the new heavens and new earth, where both Christ and his saints rule. All right, so that's the theme of the kingdom that runs all the way, at least, starting in the historical books. Some would argue that the idea of man as king really begins all the way back in Genesis, when God charges man to be fruitful and multiply, rule and reign, subdue the earth. That concept of man as God's regent on the earth, ruling over all creation, begins that early. But this is dealing more with when the monarchy begins in the nation of Israel. All right? So let's think now of another way to think about this. And really, we're just introducing our study of the Old Testament survey this morning, the storyline of the whole Bible. We start off with paradise in Genesis 1 and 2. If you think about it, there's only 2 chapters of the Bible where there's no sin, right? That's in 1 and 2 before the fall. And that paradise is lost through man's disobedience. Now, you do have 2 chapters at the end where paradise is restored in a new heavens and a new earth. It's fascinating to compare Revelation 21 and 22 with Genesis 1 and 2. There's a lot of correspondences between those 2 sections. Think about it. You have the river of life showing up again. You have the tree of life showing up again. You have God dwelling on the earth with men without a sin barrier. So that's what we mean when we talk about redemption, restoration. It's what God has worked out in the meantime. Restoration and redemption of all creation. In the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis 12, that was done through the nation of Israel. That's what the Old Testament is largely about, is God's dealing with the nation of Israel, his covenant commitments to that nation, and through them impacting the whole world, all the other nations. With the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost in Acts 2, we have the birth of this new entity called the church. And that's what Acts 2 through the end of Revelation is dealing with, although Revelation really deals with both. We have letters to the 7 churches there, but you also have things that take place after the church is raptured out of the world. And also during this time, from Acts 2 to the present day, you have still Israel as distinct, as preserved by God, even though in unbelief. And the New Testament tells us about that. They've been temporarily set aside, temporarily hardened, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes into the church. The cross of Christ, of course, is central to all this. As Frank said earlier, that sacrifice, that payment for sin had to be made in order for redemption to be accomplished. And that is anticipated in the Old Testament. It's made abundantly clear as Christ comes in the New Testament, and as the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament epistles explain what he accomplished in his death and resurrection. All right, so that's kind of running through the whole Bible. Let's talk a little more specifically now about the Old Testament, the shape of the Hebrew canon. There's a saying by Christ, a quotation by Christ in Luke 24 that says, he said to them, "These are my words, which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." So he's speaking about the Bible of his day, and he's speaking about the 3 major divisions in which the people of Israel thought about the Bible. We have a more recent acronym called the Tanakh that stands for these 3 divisions in the Hebrew Bible. Does anybody besides Matt know what that stands for?
Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim.
Very good. So the Torah It's the law. It's what we know more than just the Mosaic Law, but the first 5 books of Moses. We also call it the Pentateuch. Pentateuch means 5 books or 5 scrolls. Nevi'im are the prophets, and according to the Hebrew canon, the prophets are divided up into former and latter. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. Now you notice that's a little bit different from our English versions. The English versions that we use today have exactly the same books as the Hebrew Bible, but they're just divided up or categorized a little bit differently. I asked Matt if I could use his Hebrew Bible as a visual aid this morning. You can tell it's Matt's because it's been very well worn, and he's kept it together with tape. But Hebrew Bible, as you know, or as you may know, Hebrew is written from right to left, and you start a Hebrew book in the back, what we would call the back. So Genesis is very end here, and you turn the pages this way, and you read right to left. So that's a little different from what we're used to, but you know, they did this before we did, so maybe we're the ones that are out of line. But these are the divisions. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketubim are the writings. Those include the wisdom literature, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. It also includes Ruth, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. They're considered one book in the Hebrew canon, and Chronicles. Now,
Why is Daniel not considered a prophet?
that was my question for you. Why? What do you think as a possibility as to why he's not included in the prophets? Certainly, the book is full of prophecy.
Because they haven't been fulfilled.
No, it wouldn't be because they haven't been fulfilled. Some of them have been, in fact.
And because he wasn't formally sent as a prophet.
Exactly. What was Daniel?
He was a prophet.
He's really a statesman, right? He was elevated to serve in Gentile kingdoms, both in Babylonian and Medo-Persian kingdoms. He was a prophet, I would argue, just because of God giving him revelation. He proclaimed that revelation. He was a spokesman for God, so certainly he was a prophet in that sense. But he was not called as a prophet the way that the other Old Testament prophets
He didn't have
were.
the office.
He didn't have the office of the prophet.
And I think he didn't have the opportunity because those prophets were speaking to the people who still have a chance to repent and turn and listen to the prophets. But by the time Daniel came along, there was no chance because they were all captives.
They were all captives, but boy,
There was no nation anymore.
but he has prophecies that speak about the restoration of the nation.
Right, yeah,
And
but
he-
they, as far as the nation was concerned, it constituted of a bunch of prisoners. While those Old Testament prophets, they were speaking to actually a constituted country that was independent.
That's true.
And the people could have said, listen to
Repent.
the prophet and repent
Yeah.
and survive as that unity of nation. But by this time, they are all
They're scattered,
They're
to be
scattered,
sure.
yeah.
And a lot of his prophecy has to do with the series of Gentile kingdoms that will come after
and the
him.
restoration. at the
That's
end.
right,
They
that's
come
right.
together.
Did he ever even I feel like the other prophets would always go and talk to people that were Israel. Did he ever actually say any of his prophecies to Israelites? Because I don't think of a lot of Israelites as being around and kind of what he was saying sort of.
Yeah.
Did he ever say those things to them, or was it just that they were recorded and then later Israel?
Well, you remember, there are some Israelites in the same place where he is. So to me, it would be out of question. I don't know that it says anywhere in Daniel that he's talking to Israelites exclusively. Usually he's talking to the leaders of the Gentile empires. He's talking to kings. And of course, his written ministry would have been to Israel. I mean, after he writes this book, for them to have it and to know what was going to happen to them after their exile was extremely important. So I don't know exactly how that was distributed out to all Israel and at what point. I mean, I understand the distinction that you're making, and I agree that it was a different kind of prophetic ministry, but no less important and no less prophecy, because it is, to me, Daniel is one of the most important prophetic books in the canon because it gives the long-term future of the nation of Israel, and from where we stand, we can see that it's all been fulfilled. Does that answer your question? Notice that when Christ says what he says, he talks about the law of Moses, prophets, and the Psalms. And in this case, the Psalms kind of stand in for what we would call the writings, or what the Hebrews call the writings. Ketubim, that's what that word means. So it's more than just Psalms. In that division, it's all these other books as well. It's interesting, we talk about the Hebrew Bible. Does anybody know what the last book in the Hebrew Bible is? Chronicles. And Chronicles has a lot of genealogy in it. It's kind of recapturing Israel's history. First 9 chapters of First Chronicles just traces the history of Adam down through the 12 tribes. And then it's interesting that the very first book of the New Testament is also a genealogy that picks up and traces the genealogy of Christ. Matt, jump in here if there's anything. Okay. So let's compare the divisions of the Hebrew Bible, that we call God's Older Testament, with the divisions within the English canon. We have the Pentateuch is the same as the Torah. It's the first 5 books of Moses. They're very foundational for the rest of Scripture. Again, all the major doctrines of Scripture are found in the first 5 books. I'm talking about the doctrine of God himself, the doctrine of man, the doctrine of sin. All those are in the first 5. They relate to the formation of the nation of Israel. The historical books in our Bibles are basically Joshua through Esther. And they continue the storyline of the development, ascent, decline, exile, and partial restoration of the nation of Israel. I say partial. Certainly the Old Testament records the fact that there was decrees that were issued by the kings of the day, allowed them to go back and rebuild their temple and their city. And people were free to go back and live in the land. Most of them didn't go. It was a very small percentage of the people that actually returned. And even then, they didn't return and live according to what the prophets said they would live. They were still, even then, they were still subject to foreign powers, and they weren't the head of the nations. They didn't have a Messiah that was ruling from their own Davidic throne. They didn't have all the productivity that was promised in the prophets. Wisdom literature we talked about is Job through the Song of Solomon. And then the prophets, we also call them the latter prophets. They call the nation back to covenant loyalty and warn the nation of the impending day of the Lord. They do other things besides that, but those are 2 major things that they do. We further subdivide these prophets into major and minor, not because of any difference or in the significance of their message, really only to do with the length of the message. Major prophets are longer, and the minor prophets are also known as the 12, Hosea through Malachi. We also call them the 12. They were written on one scroll. They were short enough where you could write all 12 books on a single scroll. And that's why they're called minor prophets as well. Just the length of their message was smaller. Matt will be the one to teach us about the 12. And one of the things that he will point out to us is, even though they're individual books and they have individual messages as the 12, there are common themes across them too. And I think he'll argue even that there's a structure to the 12 prophets. That would be fascinating. I've enjoyed the times I've heard him do that already. All right, let's think about how the Old Testament books and the covenants integrate together. We see 4 of the 6 covenants that are made with Israel, if we don't count the Noahic covenant, are listed in the Torah, are described in the Torah. This is during the time of the patriarchs and Moses. We have the Abrahamic, Mosaic, priestly, and Deuteronomic covenants. Then in the historical books, Joshua through Esther, we see the development of Israel moving from a theocracy where God was their king to a monarchy. And over the course of that monarchy, because of their disobedience, they were exiled and then ultimately restored. And the Davidic covenant is made during this time. During the time of the major prophets, which runs concurrent with the historical books and the minor prophets, we have the making of the new covenant. And again, that's looking at primarily an enablement of Israel to keep the law of God in a way that they haven't before. The wisdom literature runs all through this period. I mean, what I mean by that, if you have Psalms that are written by Moses, at least one. You have the book of Job that I've become more and more convinced is written by Solomon, but the setting of the book of Job, the time of the events of that book are during the time of the patriarchs. You have Proverbs that are collected by Solomon and by others, over a long time span. So I've just put that down there as running all the way through the Old Testament. It probably should be shorter. It shouldn't come all the way out to the very end. All right, so that is an overview of our study. It's an overview of our survey of the Old Testament. Again, I would encourage you to get and begin to read those books if you haven't already. Next week, we'll do one more overview before we get into Genesis itself and just look at the Pentateuch as a whole. Are there any questions about anything?
What do you think about that chronological one?
So, I've never read through that. To me, the concept makes sense, that you actually have the prophets that are lined up with the kings and the people to whom they're speaking, but I've never used one. I've never used one to do a Bible read-through. I've talked to people that have used them and really like them.
I like it. You read it through, so it's like a bird's eye view.
What is the translation on that? Is it King James?
I think so.
Okay. I've gotten used to reading the prophets together, and I think in a case like the 12, which I guess we would still, I don't know, how do they do the 12 minor prophets?
It's been a while since I read it. I'm going to
Okay.
pick it up and dust it off of the shelf.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense that you would have the prophets speaking at the same time that you're reading through Kings. It would help you understand both sides better, both books better.
It's just like a harmony.
Exactly.
Style.
That's right. And I think that's an invaluable tool.
Yeah. To put it in that order there.
That's right.
Because it's so in this geometry to read it.
Right.
And plus you can't read through the whole Old Testament at one time. It's kind of tiring. So by the time you get to the middle, you forget what happened in the beginning.
Yeah.
Put the prophets back there where they should have been and all that stuff is difficult. So
Yeah.
I think it's
helpful.
helpful, it's
Yeah.
like any tool.
Yeah.
It's just a tool.
Why do you think Solomon wrote,
So for a long time, I didn't think that. Let me answer that. One, because he was a wisdom guy, and he wrote much of the wisdom literature. It's a wisdom book, and it certainly was within his capability to write it.
so you just think that God gave him revelation about what happened to him?
Yes, I do. I don't think Job himself wrote the book because unless, Job is never told, at least by God at the end of Job, that Satan is the one who came and asked him for permission to do what he did. So, I think most people, myself included, kind of assume that Job wrote the book just because his name is on it.
I was
Okay.
wondering why you thought it was
Let me read a chapter out of Job
I
2.
would just maybe thought it was passed down from, the story was passed down, because I always thought that he was really old compared to even
was.
Abraham,
So again,
before even that.
well, how old did he live to be? 120? A lot older than that. It tells us
Not
that
old, I meant further back in
ancient.
time.
Yeah. So I would argue, and I think a lot of commentators argue, that he was contemporary with the patriarchs just because, wealth was measured in livestock and what was owned. There's no mention of the law or of priest or temple. So it seems to precede those things. So it seems to me that, yes, the actual events, and I do believe it's a literal book, even though it's written in poetic form, I think it's describing things that actually happened. The actual events were back during that time period. Doesn't necessarily mean, it would have to either been given by divine revelation or as a story passed down through generations. And again, we can't say for sure who wrote the book, but I want to read to you one thing out of it that kind of makes me think of this. I just think, for one, it has a lot in common with the themes of Proverbs, particularly the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom. And we can look at this more when we actually get to Job. Maybe I won't take the time to read the whole chapter, but this afternoon, if you have a chance, look at Job chapter 28. Look at the fact that Job is speaking in chapter 27, and he's speaking again in chapter 29, but see how different 28 is. I think it's kind of the center of the book, and it's written by, instead of one of the three friends of Job, instead of Job himself, this is like the narrator talking, and he's giving the purpose of the book, really, in Job chapter 28. And to me, that chapter sounds a lot like the things that Solomon says. It's very much a wisdom kind of chapter. And again, it doesn't prove that Solomon wrote it, but I think you can certainly make the case that he did. I don't think there's any question that Solomon wrote Proverbs. He collected Proverbs. Some of the ones that are in there are, were original to somebody else. He also wrote Ecclesiastes. He wrote Song of Solomon. Again, that's not proof that he wrote Job, but as you read some of those books and you read Job 28, I think you can certainly make the case that he could have written it. Anything
So
else?
Solomon knew Job.
I'm not saying he knew him. I'm saying, yeah. In the same way, I would contend that Moses wrote all 5 books, but he wasn't there during the first 11 chapters of Genesis. He's having to get both divine revelation and oral history that's passed down to him.
I think he was writing a biography about Job. Like he heard stories and clearly God helped him.
Yes.
But if he's
Yeah.
writing a biography about him as well,
So
I'm
Job-
picturing.
Lived before Solomon or during
Yes.
Solomon?
I believe he lived way before Solomon.
Way before.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, and maybe you're going to talk about this when you talk about the book, but it sounds like you think he was alive during the time of like Abraham and people.
Yes.
I always picture him as being alive before the flood, just because of them talking about dinosaur type creatures and stuff.
So
Do you not believe that? Or
well, I think he could have known about those things. I'm not convinced that all the dinosaurs were wiped out by the flood. I think those would have been on the ark, some of them. And the sea creature that he talks about, I'm not convinced that some of those aren't still out there, because there's huge amounts of the ocean that we don't know what's in there. Job's age, which I can't remember right now, but it's given at the end of the book.
140.
So you think-
140?
140.
you
So
think
that-
he was younger?
It
that
fits
time
more with
than-
post-flood
Okay.
ages. Again, 140 was seen as a long life. He's full of days, and the people that lived before the flood were 800
Wow.
We will talk about that more, though, when we get there, just why we would put him in that particular time period.